Hello, welcome to Root Causes, and we are once again joined by our guest, Sam Jaques of the University of Waterloo. Sam, thank you much for coming back and joining us again. I guess we didn't torture you enough the last time, so you're back for more.
Thanks for having me back.
And we do, I think we want to touch in our last episode, where we talked about this, rather famous graph that you put up that a lot of people like to look at. And you were clarifying for us how you feel we should interpret this graph. And one of the tones of what you said, if I may paraphrase, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, is that maybe we don't need to be quite as panicked as some people appear to be. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, so, with the caveat that saying no, don't panic as much is a little bit risky, because if I say, oh, don't panic as much, and you don't do the transition, and it turns out I was more pessimistic about the growth of quantum computers than I should have been, and all of your data is available in 5 years, egg on my face.
Sure. But with that said, help us understand how you would frame, based on your chart and your study of this, which obviously is much more than, let's say, mine, how you would frame the level of concern we want to have about this relative to the whole menagerie of security concerns that we all live with all the time.
Yeah. I think what I try to do with my chart is kind of put out the information about quantum computing in the hopes that someone else who is more qualified about the broader cybersecurity ecosystem can then make their decision with this piece of information. Because, this isn't really my background. So especially right now, I hear people kind of talking about the concerns of Mythos, for example, or other kind of large language model and AI attacks. Those seem a little more dangerous a little sooner, to me at least. But I'm not an expert in that area, so I don't know what to say about that. I think the big thing about it has always been, I'm a little bit skeptical about quantum computing in 5 years. That seems like quite a stretch to me. But at the same time, I'm not so skeptical that I would imagine, the low level of probability in this happening that would justify not making the transition, right?
Yeah.
Because the consequences, of course, if I'm wrong about this, and in fact we get a quantum computer in 5 years, sort of all of it, everything falls apart, right? Imagine
if there were a mortal threat to you, and you said there's only a 1% chance of it happening, you might say 1% is much too high, and I'm going to take measures to avoid it. Sure, that's a valid point, right?
Yeah, it's been so long, what was the posted death rate of COVID? I think that was single-digit percentages, and I think we justifiably took that very, very seriously.
Oh, yeah.
So...
we're all wondering what to make of the advent of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. We all know that it has such massive consequences, but on the other hand, you're saying, not an expert. I'm not sure there's anybody who has the complete understanding of the nuts and bolts nuances of the engineering of current quantum computers, as well as what are the surprises in the math of cryptography that will come along. I think that all of that together is one heck of it's a combination that I don't know anybody really thoroughly has, and therefore we're all looking at each other. That's why we have people like you on who publish charts that are extremely thought-provoking and are giving us different perspectives and help to reveal other perspectives as well. In the previous podcast that we had you on, you were talking about how if you were to redo the chart right now, you'd have to put it into multi-dimension, making it even more difficult to interpret. And that's something interesting to chew on just in our minds as it is. So what do you think would come along to help us to understand this combination of quantum error handling, number of stable qubits, special codes that are coming along, pushing everything to the left of your chart? You're going to probably be one of the people who helps for all of us to interpret where we actually are. And what would your next chart have to really look like? You were starting to talk about it last time, but I think, this is your chance to maybe give us some insight for what's coming next.
Like, what would it have to look like for us to
Yeah.
say, oh, definitely things are really concerning now? Yeah, it's a funny thing because one thing that we would really want to see maybe is kind of an actual, exponential progress that we can point to and say definitely. And I saw a chart recently that had drawn some qubit counts of various devices, and they on a log chart, and it sure looked like they were following straight lines, but there were some points missing, maybe some choices I don't agree with. It's too early to say, here's the quantum version of Moore's law. Like, here's where we're at and trying to get a precise number. And so without that, it's hard to say even, how many years do we have? And I think what's been the interesting thing about this is it always makes sense to have a small probability of some leap that we're not expecting, where, it doesn't follow the current progress. And if we're getting to the point where actually a small leap a big leap plus a few, regular progress gets us to some of these cryptographically relevant quantum computers, then that starts to be worth being concerned about. So let's say the 26,000 qubit number. Let's say one of these multi-thousand neutral atom experiments, they actually, implement all of the parts of a quantum computer, which they haven't yet, but let's say they do that. That'd be a huge leap all of a sudden, and we'd say, whoops. And that's the kind of thing that I'm still sort of worried about, that without being able to point to a particular progress, I think the chart even now is a little bit concerning from that perspective. We're not that far. There's not too many unexpected leaps to get us to the scary part.
So, Sam, you mentioned the quantum equivalent of Moore's law, which I think is a really interesting way to look at it. First of all, do you feel that we have observed something so far that resembles that? And then connected to that, do you think that, does it stand to reason that the quantum equivalent of Moore's law must occur, or is it possible that it doesn't?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is I don't think we've observed this, but that's a controversial thing. And I had someone email me recently even to say, hey, I don't agree with that. And they pointed to these charts that make it look like we have. So it's the kind of thing where you have, intelligent, even unmotivated people on one side or the other of this question. So maybe we have, maybe we haven't. I think an interesting question on whether we should expect this is just kind of everyone sort of wants it to happen. And we kind of saw that, from what I've heard, this is what's really pushing semiconductors to continue following Moore's law, is like now everyone involved in the space expects it to happen and wants it to happen. So everyone's really pushing to make this happen. And
certainly there are massive financial motivations for it to happen. And there's massive investment based on those financial motivations. And that's the same in classic semiconductors as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, at a certain point, when it comes to maybe error rates or improved codes, like if you do the research and if the results aren't there, you can throw more money at it, but maybe the results just aren't there in a more fundamental sense beyond what money can buy. But on the other side, when it comes to just manufacturing qubits, if it's just, well, we could spend more money and we get more qubits, or, the defect rate of the manufacturer goes down, you could just spend more money and do that, right? And so if you start to get these returns, then maybe just from an investment point of view, you can push your way into something like Moore's law, in the same way that like other technologies, solar, I think is growing exponentially, just because people want it now and it's starting to have these returns that have this positive feedback loop. Quantum is in a bit of a funny place where it might be a while before we get a positive feedback loop because there might not be any actual profitable uses of the quantum computer until they're at the scale of something near Shor's algorithm and breaking cryptography anyway. But again, who knows? Yeah.
I think the who knows is what's most important here, because I think what we've seen, I could be wrong. It seems to be a lot of different opinions, and maybe they all have certain kinds of validity. But it's almost like a steady stutter forward. And I think that what we have to acknowledge is the sheer amount of brain power and investment to make these stutters forward is colossal. And Tim and I have talked about this before, where the reason why these colossal investments have been made is because nobody wants to be left behind with respect to being in possession of sovereign attainment of a cryptographically quantum computer is so strategically critical that people are going to continue to have multiple Manhattan level projects in order to be able to get there. And that's why this doesn't look normal, because it's not normal engineering. This is
No.
it at its absolute extreme in every single way,
Right.
and therefore and there's so much probably that none of us have heard about because of the fact that it's all secrets.
And Sam, you talked about this positive feedback loop and the fact that that isn't occurring yet with quantum computing from that economic perspective. I think that's absolutely right. On the other hand, I think we're looking at a reasonably large number of technically astute entities that have, for our purposes, infinite money, who have decided that this is the future, and they don't really care about the short-term P&L. They want to own the world, and they know it's going to take some time, but they think someone's going to own the world, and they want to be the ones. And in that sense, I think that what you absolutely would expect, which is that economic positive feedback loop in most technology spaces, not really sure that's required here.
Yeah.
Right?
The comparison with the Manhattan Project is interesting because, I mean, that was massive government funding. And the interesting thing here is all the leaders are private companies. So
That
it's
we
all
know
private
about.
money.
Except
Yeah,
for
we
the
know
other
about
side
it.
of the Pacific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly. So at least the American approach is, let's not make this as a big war effort. Let's have corporations spend an enormous amount of money for the profit effort.
Right.
And yeah, that's an interesting perspective, of course, that they might just decide, no, we're going to do this, from the effectively infinite pool of money. The funny thing about quantum computing is I feel like at this point, every big tech company must have a quantum computing department because it would look bad. You would look like you are not a leader of technology if you aren't publishing in quantum computing. So it's almost weirdly parasitic on the profitable arms of the company as a field. But, that's and I say this, in a, as kindly as I can.
As kindly as I can. I'm calling you a parasite, but I'm doing it as kindly as I can.
I just mean in, a functional sense, not in a moral sense.
We know what you mean.
No, it's actually a perfect term. However, if you use the UK as an example of something that's very public, 2.5 billion pounds doesn't sound like an enormous amount compared to overall spending for large U.S. tech or what's going on the other side of the Pacific. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of startups and sometimes some large enterprises over in the UK they're going to soak up that 2.5 billion and do some interesting things with it. And I'm pretty darn sure that Lawrence Livermore Laboratories and their infinite funding is probably behind things that are going on in the U.S. that might not be talked about, and that's perfectly fine. We don't have to speculate here, but I think if we're dealing with just the known truth, then I completely agree. But in reality, the Department of Energy in the United States was behind the Manhattan Project, and it's probably behind this as well.
Well, and I think just to kind of pick up what you're saying and alter it a little, Jay, which is even in the event that the only progress is the stuff that is publicly visible, which is what you've been focused on modeling, Sam. Mm-hmm. We already come up with the forecasts and the estimates we're looking at. Now, in the event that there's a significant amount of shadow research, which I believe at least in countries outside of the U.S. there is for sure, then that might just put us in a different spot. The gray lower left corner of the chart might be shaped a little differently than what we are able to see. Is that a fair
Sure.
characterization, Sam?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's another thing where I'm talking about, these unexpected leaps. One of them is actually behind the scenes, a three-letter organization in some country has been pushing further than what we see publicly. At least for me, if I was, say, director of the NSA and I was interested in a quantum computer, I wouldn't waste my money on the research that companies are doing now. I'd let them get a lot closer. Then I'd scoop the talent and make the final push. So yeah, if you start seeing some of these big names suddenly go dark, I think that's definitely the day that you need to be done your transition.
Well, now we know who you're working for, Sam. Thanks for revealing that. Just kidding, of course. Just kidding.
Not yet.
This is
Not yet.
great. Thank you, Tim. This is what a great conversation. We're going to have Sam back.
I agree. Yeah, we'd love to have you back, and certainly as developments occur in this space, which we watch pretty vigilantly, Jason and I do. It might be that it makes sense to get you back to give us some color commentary on those as they occur.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me on again.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Sam Jaques from the University of Waterloo.